Right, good evening everybody and welcome to the Wiener Holocaust Library. I'm Barbara Warnock from the library and I'm really pleased that we're hosting this 2G event. I think it might be the first in-person one we've done since COVID, is it? I think so. So it's really great to have some people back in the room with us again and see you back in the library. And we were delighted to be hosting tonight's event by Matthias Weniger on the restitution of stolen silver. Really fascinating subject. So I'm not going to say very much other than to just say we've got a programme of events at the library and have a look online to find out more and new exhibitions coming up and so on. Just for the people who are here, if the fire alarm sounds, there's only one fire exit and that's out the main door the way you came in. And then should you need the toilets, you leave this room by the door you came in and then you go along the corridor to the back of the building and then down in the lifts to the basement. There will be chance for questions both from the online audience and in-person audience at the end. And just to say to anyone who is speaking tonight that for the people online to hear you, you have to speak into the mic. You really cannot hear people just generally in the room. It doesn't pick the sound up. So I'm now going to hand over to Gina and Tom from the 2G network. So I'll just switch the other mic on.
Okay, thank you very much, Barbara, and good evening, everybody. My name's Gina Burgess-Winning. I'm a member of the Second Generation Network Committee. I'd like to wish you all a very warm welcome to this Network Wiener Holocaust Library event. For those here in person, it is wonderful to be back in our home at the library. It's also lovely to see all those who are joining us via Zoom. For anyone who is attending their first network event, the network was founded 27 years ago and is for the children, grandchildren, and families of refugees from and survivors of the Holocaust. We explore and share the impact the Holocaust has had and continues to have upon us. If any of you would like more information about the network or to join us or receive our events emails, please email a membership@secondgeneration.org.uk. There are also some copies of our magazine here, Voices, which you'd be very welcome to take. We're really delighted that Dr. Matthias Weniger has come over from Munich to speak to us this evening about the restitution of stolen silver, a subject that will touch those of us whose relatives in Nazi Germany were forced to hand in all their precious metals. I'm also very grateful to network member Tom Willett for organizing this event, and he will be introducing our speaker and chairing the event. Before I hand over to Tom, I'd like to confirm there will be time for your questions and comments after the presentations, and I'd be grateful if you could keep them as concise as possible. Okay, over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Gina. So I'm just going to quickly introduce Matthias and then say a very short bit about how I met him. So Dr. Matthias Weniger has been head of provenance research at the Bavarian National Museum since 2019. Weniger studied art history in Berlin, Bonn, and Barcelona, completing his PhD in 2000. He has worked for state museums in Berlin, the painting collections in Dresden, and teaches at LMU Munich. In addition to his current position as curator of the medieval and Renaissance sculptures and paintings at the Bavarian National Museum, he has long focused on the history of collecting and provenance issues. In 2011, he worked on a project concerned with sculptures owned by Hermann Göring, and he now leads the network of provenance researchers in Bavaria. In 2019, Dr. Weniger began directing a project tracing the heirs of 111 silver objects confiscated by the Nazi state and later bought by the museum. The objects had been seized and sold to the museum as part of the gigantic silver levy imposed on German Jews in 1939. Dr. Weniger will explain how he and his small team have been tracing the heirs and returning items to them since 2019. And now just for a very small bit about how I met Matthias. In December 2022, a journalist called Dina Gold sent me an article she was working on in relation to Matthias and his work. She talked about the administrative logjam at the Bavarian State Ministry of Science and Arts that had left some families waiting well over a year for the legal release of silver items owed to them. So there is a lot of information about stolen artworks, but I personally anyway had not come across much information about stolen silver objects. So Dina kindly put me in touch with Matthias, who I met for the first time over Zoom. And so I personally began to look into the British dimensions of the story. I interviewed 5 families living in the UK, some of whom might be listening now, who had had silver items returned to them. These everyday items provide a vital physical link to the past, and in many cases, the process of deciding what to do with an object brought relatives together. I'll hand over to Matthias now and let him tell us all about his ongoing project.
Take it. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to be invited to speak to you, and especially also to give the first talk after the pandemic. So many thanks for the invitation. Okay, this was the wrong one.
Yes, if you want to move the slides on,
Just with that one. Okay. Yeah, okay. Tom has already briefly mentioned in February and March 1939, all German Jewish citizens had to hand in by 2 weeks previous advice all their precious metals, not just silver, also gold and platinum, to over 65 pawn shops all over the Reich. There's no photographic documentation on that, at least not known until present. What I show you is a photo from 1924 from a big phase of big economic depression, when Berliners brought their precious objects to the pawn shop in Berlin, the same pawn shop later the Jewish people had to bring their objects to. And we can just imagine that the situation might have looked quite similarly in 1939. We know it, of course, from description. Also, this photo is not from 1939, but from 1926, also from the Berlin pawn shop. And again, we might imagine that the masses of silver that climbed up in the pawn shops might have looked something similar to this situation. And one final photograph that is not from 1939, that was a silver, voluntarily silver levy that Germans gave for the First World War to buy arms for the First World War. And again, these objects from daily life might look quite similar to what was amassed in the pawn shops in 1939. We know just a few objects that survived thanks to the museum purchases. From all the others, we can only judge by the written descriptions we have. But we can imagine from what is, for example, at our museum, that most of the objects were really from daily life, especially from the daily religious life. We had at our museum a lot of pairs of candlesticks, a lot of cups that might have been used as, or have probably been used as Kiddush cups, a lot of little sword vessels or vessels for specimen, and but also very ordinary objects like spoons, large spoons, ladles, things of that kind. And not necessarily all of Jewish origin. There were also collector pieces among them. Does that work? No. So quite in the center, you see one object that might look a bit strange to you, and it is really a cruet from the Holy Mass from Catholic service that has ended up as a collector's piece in one of the families. I said these pawn shops were spread all over the Reich. That means the Reich in February, March 1939. That does not yet comprise what is here in that map from the Germany of the time is called Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. This entered a bit later in 1939, but all the other regions marked in red. What means that some of the pawn shops lay in what is today Poland and also what is today Russia up to the north in then East Prussia. And of course also Austria, which is here since 38 included in that map of the Reich. A modern map might make the image a bit clearer. So the yellow part did not enter, but all the other areas, also the annexed areas of the Czechoslovak Republic, were part of the silver levy. The main cities where most silver was handed in were Vienna, Berlin, then Breslau, today Wrocław, and Hamburg, followed by Hamburg, and Munich came then not among the very biggest city, but also quite a big number of silver that came in there. Oh no, that's the wrong one again. Here's a list of the pawn shops. We know this from the communication by the Ministry of Economy, Reichswirtschaftsministerium, which was directed by Hermann Göring, as many other institutions. And you see the cities that were included in this organization to take over the precious metals from the Jewish families. Big cities, but also small cities where just 100 Jews brought their silver to. The distribution is very uneven and a bit difficult to understand in some instances. For example, Würzburg, where quite a number of Jewish families lived, had no pawn shop to take over the silver, so the Jews from Würzburg had to bring their silver to Frankfurt or to Bamberg instead. And Magdeburg had no pawn shop, but the much smaller Halberstadt nearby. So this distribution is a bit difficult to understand from later perspective. These pawn shops draw up lists, very German efficient bureaucracy, very detailed bureaucracy about the purchases and the sales, because the Jewish families were normally paid for the objects in some towns in cash, in other towns the money was sent to them with a month or a few months delay. These details are handled differently from town to town. All gold and platinum was not sold by the individual pawn shops, but had to be sent to Berlin. And this is a place in Berlin that handled the central administration of the silver levy. Unfortunately, the documentation of this place is lost. There had been some bombing of this place, which ironically also served to train against bomb raids. And so we do not have documentation from Berlin, which is really the center of the documentation is missing. Most of the sales of the pawn shops went to melting companies, especially the Degussa. Again, ironically, a very big company where a lot of Jewish families had stakes in, as I know from the files now. So this was by far the company who took over most of the material. Then there were other melting companies, also local silversmiths, sometimes also some dealers, but most of the silver was melted. And from some cities, all silver was melted. There were no sales whatsoever. When the levy was completed, or the administration of the levy was completed in 1940, the pawn shops drew up final reckonings for the Berlin administration. The Berlin data are lost, but we know the copies that were done in the individual pawn shops. And we also see from these documents that the difference between the purchases and the sales was quite small. Normally it's between 10 and 20%, which means that the pawn shops gained 10 to 20% more than they sold to the families. So the benefit in purely economic terms was very limited, and the only way to explain the entire levy was to demoralize the Jewish population, to take away their goods from their daily life, and in a way of accumulation. This seems the only explanation, because the bureaucracy employed in all this was enormous. Pawn shops had to hire additional personnel to manage the situation, and this certainly these extra costs were absorbed by the small plus the individual pawn shops made. And in addition, they had to send the money they gained to Berlin as well. In some cities, we have documentation that makes that gives an idea of the personal tragedies involved in the levy. Especially from rural areas, the silver was not brought directly to the pawn shops, but sent in parcels. And then we have letters that went with the parcels, and they are preserved in a couple of places. And people like this old lady you see on the left-hand side that sent her silver to Dortmund, begging that she might keep at least a few objects, since this is all she has from her family and all that reminds her of her ancestors. Of course, this was not at all respected. She even had to return some of the money she had been paid, because it was said there was an error in the account. And of course, like most of the persons who handed over silver in 1939, she did not survive either. This is the Stolperstein for that lady I had showed to you, because February, March 39 was quite a late date. In the case of the objects I'm working with at the National Museum in Munich, 2/3 of the owners did not survive the Shoah. In Munich alone, up to 10 tons of silver were amassed in this building, which was the central pawn shop of the city of Munich, modern building from the 1920s. We have similar buildings and similar style buildings in London. Again, no photographic documentation of that. 2,306 consignments altogether were counted at the Munich pawn shop. In Munich, sales went again mainly to the melting companies, but also to dealers, to silversmiths, and to a couple of museums. among them the Bavarian National Museum, one of the big museums that cover art and culture of almost all periods after the antiquity, which was founded in the 1850s, modeled on the Victoria and Albert Museum, and even in the building some gives some idea of these traditions. The museum bought about 350 objects from the silver levy in 4 purchases in 39 and 40. The first one in 39 is the only one that has still numbers, the names of the previous owners in the lists. The 3 other purchases in 1940. The objects were put in the inventories of the period and were drawn. There was no photography done at the period, but of many of the objects, drawings were made. 2/3 of these objects were returned in the 1950s and 60s, but at that time, objects were only returned if families made a claim for them or made a claim for property lost in general. And then the authorities looked into the existing documentation, saw that pieces had been bought by the museums, and approached the museums to ask whether the objects were still there. This led to the return of 2/3 of the objects, but 111 remained where no such claims were made, or where the museum was not approached, or where the museum said it could not find the objects. And these remaining objects were stored in this condition when I first saw them almost 20 years ago, and later in a nicer cupboard that you see here. I saw them first almost 20 years ago when I started to work at the Bavarian National Museum, and when I discovered documentation on the seizure of the Jewish art collections after Kristallnacht in 1938 by the Gestapo. I immediately published that documentation, centering my attention on 2 collections. And one of these 2 collections, the one of Ludwig Gerngross, he had sisters who owned silver. So this is how I came first across the silver and spoke to the curators of that time. The idea of the museum, the intention was not really to hide the objects, but the idea was that there were no families left. There was no one left who could be interested in these objects, that this was just a very sad and tragic aspect of the history of the museum, but that it would be very difficult to do anything about it. Nevertheless, the silver colleagues then started research into these items and wrote the first important article on the silver objects in the Bavarian National Museum. And in the following years, Tom has mentioned the first project we did on sculptures owned by Hermann Göring, and then one after the other, we looked into the objects with NS context. And the last project, and this was done by someone who was employed for 5 years on a full term basis. I'm just doing this apart from my other duties, as Tom has said. And as a last of his projects, he published that catalog that I also have with me and that you are happy to have a look into, and that will then stay here and go into the Wiener Library. And in parallel, he mounted an exhibition on all objects. Both in the catalog and in the exhibition, the objects were not arranged by material or by period, but by their previous owners, alphabetically arranged, and the same in the exhibition. And as you see again, this combination of cups, ladles, boxes, candlesticks, how do we, the idea of my predecessor was that this exhibition and this publication would guarantee that the objects would be claimed by the families, because all information was made available in the internet. And the hope was that anyone looking for the history of Hermine Bernheimer, for example, working on the genealogy of the Bernheimer family, would come across our database, would find that there's an object with the museum and would claim it. This did not materialize. Just in 2-3 cases, families really approached the museum. So when I took over in 2019, it became clear we have to do it otherwise. And I asked for additional funds to do research on the families, on the heirs. And I can tell you now, it was a long process and we did a lot of learning, of course. Now we are in contact with all of the families, have returned more than half of the objects by now, and hopefully will restitute most of the objects until early next year. But it was a long process, and the best way proved to be first to check if there was documentation on claims raised by the families after the war. In 2/3 of the cases, there were such claims, not necessarily for silver, but for property in general. And if there was such documentation, then we had the names of the heirs in the 1950s and 60s. So we came closer to today's situation. In some of the files, we also found additional documentation on the objects handed over, and in a very few cases, even such receipts. Gina has told me she has such a receipt from her family, so I'm very... Okay, but these are very rare, because it meant that families would have to take this into emigration, those who survived, to have such paperwork still existing. So therefore, this is extremely rare. A lot of, besides the reparation files, we worked, of course, with the internet databases, Find a Grave, Fold3, Ancestry, Jenny.com. Those of you who work with these databases know them, and also the others, database for Yad Vashem and Arolsen and so on. This was a very important part of our work. We approached institutions, home and abroad, little associations that try to preserve the memory of Jewish families who had lived in places in Germany, Jewish museums. The one in Munich was extremely helpful in the beginning. A lot of archives, local administration, city archives, government offices. Magen David Adom was extremely helpful, the Israeli branch of the Red Cross organization, to establish contact with families in Israel. The Holocaust Claims Processing Office is helping also to our sister institution in Munich, to the City Museum there. They are extremely helpful. Local researchers we could employ via our project, also here in the UK, and many individuals inside and outside the families helped to give names, does injustice to all the others I cannot name here. So it was just a very brief overlook, and just pass pro toto the two ladies from Magen David Adom who helped enormously in Israel. The left one has lived for a long time in London, so some of you might know her. The one to the right, her grandfather was the last grand rabbi of Rotterdam, so they would have a lot of stories to tell as well, but all things we cannot enter here. where do the families live today that we find our research? About 2/3 live in the United States, a bit less than 1/3 in Israel, and the remaining are spread over different countries, a few in France, a few in the United Kingdom, Australia, Latin America, but these are all more isolated cases. In the United Kingdom, we had, in addition, the problem that during our work, we discovered that 20% of the identifications of the families we had at our museum, and also therefore of the identification that are in that catalog and that were in the exhibition, were wrong. And these errors go back to the 1940s. Of course, at that time, sadly, the families of the previous owners did not really interest as much as the silver marks. So these lists you see on the right-hand side with where the marks were drawn, those interested much more to the museum than the previous owners, and they were not very careful in the transcriptions of the lists from the pawn shops, and so these errors came up. There were also some sales immediately after the purchase to an art dealer, which was also not known until we stumbled upon these discrepancies and started a big research to eliminate these errors. I had told you just the first purchase was with names. The other 3 purchases were just with code numbers. You see a document for one of these later purchases to the left-hand side. And you see that there are just these code numbers from the pawn shop. And these then have to be compared with the numbers that are on that list with the marks. This is a very long process. You have to compare the weight, and it's really a detective work. The historian working for me with the project has done a lot of work on that. And at the end, we can safely attribute all pieces to families except for 2 cups. And case with 2 cups, it's really difficult. They are between 2 families. And of course, our aim is, and we consider it very important, to return the right objects to the right families. Since the value is above all sentimental, it does not make sense to return the wrong object to a family. But sadly, exactly in many of these cases of the 20%, we had already contacted the families or even prepared the handover documents. And so this was, of course, a documentation and a bit of a shock to some of the families. It's extremely unfortunate. And one of the families, and Tom knows very well, is here in the UK. Therefore, I'm mentioning this exactly. How closely are the heirs related? We have, of course, just 2nd generation and 3rd generation, but in some cases we are very close to the last owners. We have persons that are over 100 years old in some families and that have still a very close attachment. We have others where all the persons in yellow would have to decide what to do with an object, and this becomes close to impossible. So this is a case where I do not get answers, a lot of answers. Some people are very interested, but our lawyer insists that we need the responses of all, and at least of almost all. So they try to be generous, our administration, but of course, if just 3 people answer and the others not, no lawyer would take the risk to give it to the 3 and then the others make a claim. This is a problem. And we have 9 cases, 9 families where it is difficult to get answers, and I fear that some of these objects pertaining to these families might at the end stay with us. I'm very sad about it, but I can only write again and again and again. So this is really a dilemma. In other cases, even if the tree is complicated, like in this one, because the last owner was in the second row, and from his paternal side, there are no descendants whatsoever, not only due to the Holocaust, but also to natural deaths in the families. And but from the maternal side, we have some, and it's a relatively small number. So in these cases, solution is possible and will be achieved. I had talk on this family in the last days, and there are even other cases where there are just two heirs who are the direct grandchildren. So it's a very direct sequence. I blurred the names of the present generation for privacy reasons. And one of my first restitutions in 21 was to an old lady who still knew the last owner. And you see her on the left photo to the left as a child with her grandmother and with her mother. So there is a direct attachment to the last owner. And also in this case, the man to the left, important university teacher of literature in the United States. And he lived as a child for 1 year with his grandparents while his parents established themselves in exile in the US. And then his grandmother brought him over to the US and returned to her death in Germany. A very tragic story, but there's a direct link to these grandparents. And you see him to the right with his grandfather, who was a dean of the Faculty of Law in Munich before Hitler, and a very important person for the history of law, especially of institutional law, ironically. How do we organize restitutions? The normal concept in the world of restitutions is that people come up at the museum to pick up the objects, normally lawyers in most cases. I have a colleague from the VNA here who knows the situation very well. The difference in this project is that we do not deal with lawyers at all. Now there might be the first case where we deal with lawyers, but otherwise really just with the families directly. And some came indeed to pick up the objects at our museums. These are 2 or 3 persons of the family I showed last of the law, the Dean of Law Faculty. They had 2, 3 overseas flights to pick up the objects. And I said, we cannot expect the families to do these expensive flights to pick up the objects, which have quite a limited economic value and really a sentimental value. Jews were expected to hand all their objects over to the pawn shop in 1939, and now we should do an effort really to bring the objects to the families. This was very difficult at the beginning. Few more persons came on their own, as the one in the center from the Feuchtwanger family, also linked to Leon Feuchtwanger, who was working in Spain and therefore offered to come over to take his objects. But in general, we had to look for other ways. And in this, the articles by Dina Gold that Tom has already mentioned made quite a difference when she approached a lot of institutions. Others helped as well, as the American Consulate General to Munich, when the Consul General, you see here, visited our labs and looked on the documents and on the objects. And also the State of Israel helped. The Israel Foreign Ministry took over the transport of the objects in 2 German parcels by diplomatic luggage, and then I could pick them up in the Foreign Ministry in Jerusalem that you see in the background in the Office for Jewish Affairs. And this was the first restitution outside Munich in Paris. Then a couple of restitutions in the United States. Show just two of them. Here you see that some family members already came together from different parts of the US to take over their object. And this was much more extreme in Israel, where really very big families assembled and came from all over the country. Was very impressive, all generations from the second generation to the fourth or even fifth generation coming together to take over the objects. Another family here the same, and on this image you have to the back to the right also the German ambassador to Israel, which shows the public support and interest we also got in the course of our project, and for which I was very grateful. And of course, you also see that very different families from Orthodox to liberal, and that was a very broad spectrum of people we met. These were quite close to the Gaza Strip, a peasant family, fortunately not affected by October 7 events, as I was confirmed. So this was really impressive. In Israel, there was much less knowledge about the last owners, but to see these generations come together and also these youngest ones take part and appreciate the history of the importance of the objects for the families, that made quite an impact on all of us who were there. Where do the objects end up? Most of them, fortunately, with the families, some also with museums, as with the Jewish Museum in New York. Here a handover this, but some families also opt for exhibitions in Germany. This is the cup of Hermine Bernheimer I mentioned previously. The Bernheimer family came from Göppingen near Stuttgart, and the family, who now lives mainly in the US, also in Australia, wanted that the cup be present there in the small Jewish museum installed there a few years ago, to keep the memory of the Bernheimer family in Göppingen alive. And similarly, a family spread from South Africa over Israel to the United States, Denmark, and the United Kingdom. One of the family linked to us today via Zoom. They decided to donate 2 candlesticks to the Jewish Museum in Munich. And I told you they helped us a lot in our work. So this was a very good outcome, and they did this exhibition on around these candlesticks now. But it is just a temporary exhibition, and it is, of course, always difficult to find museums that will display the pieces forever. Therefore, for me, the ideal solution is always if the objects end up with the families, and the particularity of Israel is that the objects really get into use again. This is the first Seder table, where 2 of the objects just restituted by us were in use again. Unfortunately, I cannot move because the pointer does not. The silver cup and the sword vessel had just been restituted by us, and are here in Rehovot on the Seder table. And this is the only case, where we have a photo from the family from before the silver levy. And I hope you see just to the extreme left of the image that double cup in the form of a barrel, but you can then open it and you have 2 cups and that is now back on the table after 84 years. The objects turned into the use of the families again. This is, for me, the best that can occur. And also with another family, we handed the objects over in an early afternoon of a Friday, and they asked me, for me as a curator, it would probably be too painful if they would put candles in the candlesticks again. I said, no, it's the best you can do. And so they started Shabbat with these candlesticks, and they regularly sent me on Fridays these photos of the enlightened candlesticks and do their family life around them, which is really moving. Where do we stand now? Yesterday in Paris, I restituted object number 56 of 111. 30 cases of about 65 are completely finished via restitution. 18 more cases, all research is done, and just the details of the handover have to be fixed. So for more than 80 objects, the future is completely clear. In 9 cases, we are still doing some research, and then there are the 9 cases I already mentioned where I'm waiting for answers from the families. I hope some of them can still be solved, but this is still a problem. And so if I now look again of the images that were done for the catalog, when there was no idea how things would develop, now the object to the left, to the extreme left, is now in New Jersey. The other object that has glass inside, the second from the right, is now in California. That Christian object to the right that I had already shown to you will very probably end up in Paris with a family I met 2 days ago. And the object in front will go to a Jewish family in Munich. So some of the families are again in Germany. So this I didn't mention before. Is the project controversial? Yes, it's not universally well accepted. Of course, there's a question, why does this happen so late? Of course, it happens much too late. It should have happened in the decades ago, and one should not have waited in the 1950s and 60s for the families to come up, but should have approached the families as we do today. But we cannot change that now. We can only do what is possible today, and we cannot rectify this. Ironically, we are even early, since Munich is doing pioneering work in this. There are silver pieces in other German cities, but up to now, at least at this scale, there's only our projects. There have been individual returns, but it's not necessarily the fault of the other institutions. In Munich, we have a lot of documentation, not all, but a lot, and we have objects. In other cities, they have documentation, but no objects, or they have objects, but no documentation. There's a lot of silver in Hamburg, for example, but they cannot link it to the previous owners. And in Berlin, they have also quite a few objects. A lot is lost, but quite a few are still there. And they can be linked to, there's one linked to one owner, but for the others, no previous owner is known. But if, is it worth returning these objects? This is a question even raised by some Jewish families of Jewish collectors who say our artworks are much more important than these daily life silver items. Why do you devote so much time to them? Rather look on our collections. Of course, one has to do everything, but I think it is important from the experience we have in dealing with the families The difference is here we have really objects from daily life, and they are often the only remain of an existence wiped out by the Holocaust. And they bring together families that often had lost contact among the members. They bring to a very little extent, bring families, persons not to life again, but they keep their memory at least alive, like this case of Olga Meyer, who was up to our project just known by this police file photo. And now we brought the family together, and these private photos like Olga sipping beer in Munich, as one would expect in Munich, are coming up. This was the family where more than 30 people had to decide on the objects, but they had lost contact among them, spread over the continents. And it turned out during our Zoom meetings that in every part of the family, there were a few photos, a few letters that did not make sense in their isolation, but brought together by the family. It brought the history of the person again alive, with all the tragic details that she had been in Palestine to visit one member of the family exiled there, but then returned to Germany as the one who had brought the grandchild to the United States. And it was really moving to have these connections between the families reestablished. And some persons that, like the one to the top left, who had escaped in the last moment from Germany, was more than 100 years old to bring these families together, and of course bring all these private photos up to tragically see how deeply attached they felt to Bavarian life, to Bavarian culture. And one very tragic aspect, also these letters came up in the families, and one consequence of the Shoah. It's not only that the families are distributed all over the continents and lost contact among them, but also that they cannot read the letters of their grandparents anymore. And even so tragic letters as this one, which is written from a provisional camp on the outskirts of Munich immediately before deportation. Actually, a person linked to two of our silver families. So I brought there also two families together, and they cannot read neither German nor this old writing anymore. And Gina does, as I heard, but so this is also part of, I cannot say now it's 5 o'clock, I finish working, I help translating, transcribing these letters and these things. And at the end, and I'm told by the families that this work is much more important for the families than the actually silver objects, to bring the families together. And that's their approach at all from Germany after all what has happened, after so comes completely unexpected to all of them, and help to work on these personal objects. And will there be consequences? I hope that others will follow our example, and I'm quite confident they will. The first cases are already in the pipeline, especially now the Munich City Museum. Thanks to the research we have done, we found additional files that help them to identify the owners of their 150 objects as well. And now they had already some restitutions as well, and they are working heavily. Sometimes I bring over objects from our and from their museum together, because in some cases the same families are affected. And it also comes out of the project because thanks to the coverage we got internationally, especially in the United States, on the right from the New York Times, the long article, families approach me from all over the world, especially from the United States, and ask what has, my family comes from Breslau, from Cologne, from Hamburg. Do you know what happened to the silver there? And this made me start additional research that had also not been done in a systematic way, amazingly. So I wrote to all cities that had these pawn shops and that are in today's Germany. I also wrote to Poland, but especially to the places in Germany. And I looked on 12 city archives myself and looked up the documentation there and am in touch with local colleagues. So I hope more will follow out of that. This is the article to the left of Dina Gold that Tom had already mentioned, and to the right is Tom's important and very nicely written article itself. And also a couple of eyewitnesses came up and can add their story. So not just objects, but also story coming up here. This is a lady who remembers how her family brought the silver in Stuttgart to the silver levy, who lives north of New York and has become a friend over the project, Charlotte Isler. And there's also a lady from Indiana that remembers that she herself brought the silver to the pawn shop because her grandmother was unable, so she took the basket and went with the silver to the pawn shops, more than 100 years old, as you can imagine. This one is a bit younger. And so this last image, the work on the documentation in the other cities. In some cities, there's quite a lot of documentation still existing. This is Leipzig. You see with this German order, all these different files still there. Unfortunately, no silver in Leipzig. That's the situation I told you. And it seems there were no sales to the museum even at the time. I looked through these papers and I didn't find any indications that the pawn shop sold to the museum. So this was different in every town. There is not silver in museums in every town that was affected by this, but in some there is, and hopefully this will continue and will lead to more contacts to families and to more restitutions in the future. So thank you for your patience. And I'm very open for questions. I can speak months about this, as you may imagine.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, that was a brilliant talk. And it was amazing seeing some of those images of the objects in use now. Like I said, very touching. We're going to open up to questions now. I'll take questions from the room, and then we can let people online put their questions in the chat.
There are a few online already, so we could start there.
Yeah, should we start there?
Okay. So online, we've got a couple of sort of comments and then question. So just to say that, Matthias, that Hermina Bernheimer's great niece is on the Zoom call, and I think you showed Hermina's cup at one point. So she's commented on that as well. And she also says that we are very grateful for Matthias's great work. So questions, I'll maybe take them together. There's two questions and I'll just give them to you together. So David says, did the so-called monuments men also find missing silver? Is this connected to this story at all? And then John says, some brackets, not all museums must have known that the silver they were buying was looted. However, sometimes they claim that they purchased the pieces in good faith and therefore claim ownership. Do you believe the good faith argument?
Maybe I start with the second one. In our museum, they knew where they purchased the objects from. This was crystal clear. The director of the Bavarian National Museum had been part of the commission that looked into that were asked by the authorities to look into the 10 tons of silver amassed in the pawn shop to find out whether there were pieces of particular cultural value and prevent them from being melted, probably. So he was part of that, and he knew exactly where that came from. It was also mentioned in the documents. So I think those who bought in 1939, 40, these years, they knew exactly where this silver come from, and it's mentioned, and it was actually quite widespread, the information, because when I look in these files from the other cities, I see that companies are regularly complaining that they do not get silver. You have this silver, you have been ordered by the Ministry of Commerce to collect the silver from the Jewish families, and the Minister of Commerce says, of Economy says that companies should have access to the silver. So why don't you sell us silver? I find these letters very regularly, and they show that the information was quite widespread. And of course, there were queues outside the pawn shops of the Jewish families, and there were even advertisements in the newspapers that the Jews had to bring their precious metals to the pawn shops. So who wanted to know would have known, and the museums definitely have known at this time. If there were objects purchased in the 50s, 60s, this might have been a bit different, but not in that time. As for the Monuments Man Foundation, yes, I said, every institution I mention has a problem of the others I do not mention. They helped us also in the beginning. They helped us solve one case in particular. So they also participated in that work. Yeah.
Okay, and then just a couple more things, and then we'll go to everyone in the audience. So Sue is saying, as one of the people whom Matthias referred to, I'd like to thank him for his persistence and hard work. Our wider extended family is still in touch and are continuing to share some of our history. She says, we all thank you very much. So that's very nice. So someone online has asked if I can let people online unmute themselves, and just to tell you all, I can't. It completely wrecks the sound in here. The feedback will be terrible. So sorry about that. You'll just have to have me as your voice. And Sue also says we're looking forward to seeing Matthias again in January. And then there's just one more thing. So Holly is saying, could the catalogue, by which I assume she means that, be exhibited online? So she's actually suggesting that the library did that, but I mean, I don't know if it could be, or if it is, or anything like that. So
you mean in the way of an open access publication?
Yeah, so she's saying so that the world may view this important catalogue, and Holly's in Wisconsin in the USA.
I can discuss this. The problem is a bit that 20% of the identifications are wrong, as I told you. And a book always is taken at face value. And if you look and you see here a name attached to an object, and then you wonder why it goes to a completely different person, it's a bit difficult. There's one family here, the Gerngos family, with whom I started, as I told you, because I was working on the works of the brother of the family, and they are given 5 objects here, I think, and I was very moved to be finally in contact with them, and they sent me a lot of personal photos from the bar mitzvah of the daughter with objects from the family, from these persons murdered, and from this generation, and they get nothing because all objects were wrongly identified. And so not just the family in the UK is affected. And so this is a bit the problem I have with the catalog. This was just the error, not the fault of my predecessor. These were the errors that were in our documentation. Of course, it's published and it's accessible, but yeah, this is. I think it's better to rely on the rectified documentation in the internet, but it's also a detail we still have to do because we cannot do everything in parallel. This is my evening job, but we have to put all the right informations now in the internet for the future. It is accessible. The informations are accessible.
Just one more comment online and then we'll go to the audience here. So Ellen's just said that as a result of our connection with Matthias and Hermina's Silver Cup, our family applied for Stolperstein last year. In September, we went to Göppingen for the installation of memorial stones for my mother, her sisters and grandparents. And Ellen encourages anyone on this call to apply if they are eligible and says that Europe should be littered with these, but only slightly over 100,000 have been installed. So that's just a comment from Ellen there.
Yeah, that's the Bernheimer family. So for one family, what is mentioned here in January, I applied for this Olga Meyer I showed you in Israel. You see, I applied a plaque. In Munich, we don't have Stolpersteine, we have memorial signs. I applied for one myself. I should do for every family, but it's also a bit difficult to combine that. But in this case, I did, and we will have a ceremony in January, and family will come for that. And we had with another, I call them silver families. With another one, we had already such a ceremony last year, and we are hoping for another one with the Bernheimer family in Munich. They had the one in Göppingen, and they're trying to help to do additional ceremony in Munich.
Right, so any questions from the audience? All right, I'll hand the mic over to you.
Thank you so much, Matthias. I love the presentation and I like the way you structured it with questions, because those are always the things that we want to ask, exactly what the process is. The only thing I haven't quite got from what you've said, and it's probably me, is going back to the detective work of how you actually track down the families, because I'm imagining, for instance, in my family, names were changed. How do you actually go, how have you gone, I'm not talking about the families who've gone to you, but when you actually go to the families, how you go about doing that detective work-wise?
As I told you, we as experienced as we are now, we start with these looking whether there are claims from the 50s and 60s. Then in many cases, we have already the changed names because the name change had occurred by then already. And we are 20 years closer to today. And we also have the recognition of the heirs from the period, which is good for our lawyers from today. Also, we one generation more, and then we look for their children, grandchildren. With these internet databases I have mentioned, and there are even more, we have hints in many cases. We also look for obituaries in the United States, and as I said, Israel, Magen David Adom. In Israel, in particular, there are a lot of name changes, so therefore the work of Magen David Adom was extremely helpful. If we find one family member, it can be easy because then we have go quickly to the others, but that's not always the case. Sometimes takes a year to identify the others because the families had lost contact among them. We have also cases like that. And in one case, we were close to give the objects to 2 persons, and then we discovered that there are 30 more to decide. Yeah, it's a lot of work, but we are getting more experience with that. And I'm very grateful to the historian who works with me, who has really now a big expertise in this, and it's very quick sometimes in fine. Of course, we now know where to look and whom to ask.
Next question.
Of course, there are privacy issues, data protection issues also involved. This is another problem.
Thank you very much for the presentation and for your work personally. The levy was voluntary, and did people back in 1939 keep any objects they didn't, because they could have hidden it in their house?
It was not voluntary. No.
It wasn't.
Voluntary. No, yeah. Of course, this question also turns up from time to time. It was difficult. First of all, also the German Jews were German, and so they stick to the rules and probably also thought a life is worth more than these two silver spoons, and so I better bring them. And but in addition, the German bureaucracy was extremely efficient, and so the Jewish families had been asked to declare their valuables in a year before. So the authorities knew where there was silver, which made things more difficult. Of course, there might have been cases of hidden objects, and I hear these stories from the families I'm in touch with, that some had a few things sawn into their garments in immigration, and that the husbands told the wives afterwards, after immigration, I have these gold coins in my garment, and the wife was still very angry that he took the risk of his. We have one case where a family, head of family, committed suicide because things were found in his luggage, and yeah, so the risk was big. And I also got a few cases where people tell me that they had buried objects. And I'm working, I won't mention the city because this is of course a very delicate issue, but we are trying to make an excavation at the site and see whether there is still silver. So these are things coming up with these New York Times and with the other articles, because people write everything which is related to silver pops up with me at some stage, and they're asking these things, and it would be amazing if we still find these. The other family who told me that that was in a central place in Munich near the train station. We do not have to dig there because this has been remodeled a lot of times, and impossible to find anything there. But in the other place, it might be possible. Of course, we do not know the percentage of hidden objects. Yeah, maybe 5%, but I think not a huge amount.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Gina?
Couple of points, some of them quite small. I think one of your early slides, it had the list of the pawn shops, the Leihhaus, and there were quite a few under A, and then there was one under B, which was Kassel, which was where my family had to take their precious metals. I just wondered why Kassel was in a special category. Does that have any significance?
Yes, these are complicated details. Most of the institutions, these institutions were chosen by the central administration in Berlin, and most of the institutions chosen were municipal pawn shops. But there, in a few cities, there were special arrangements. In Stuttgart, it was linked to a bank, but this is just on a level of administration. And in Bremen as well, it has a special name. And in Hanau, I think, and in Kassel also it was. So it was not called the municipal pawn shop. It was
yeah, it was called the Landesleihhaus.
It was a bit completely a bit differently organized, but the result was the same. Bigger was the difference in Austria, because in Austria the confiscation was done by the Dorotheum, by the leading art auction house. So they were the institution to bring the silver to in Austria. And the silver from Vienna was the biggest amount of all.
What about Cologne? Because I have relatives who are there. I know also from documents that were in Berlin that silver was left in sort of safekeeping of some neighbors, and then there was a dispute after the war about returning it.
In Cologne, there is some documentation as well. Yeah, and
so it might be worth looking into that.
And with these objects kept, we have both things. We have families where the families were after the war immediately approached by those who had kept the objects, and there are very nice stories of returns, and of course there are the other stories as well.
Have there been any cases where there has been a dispute about what to do with the object, where you have several members of the family who are the heirs?
Of course. As I told you, I really try to bring the objects back to the families, and it's difficult if there are 30 members, and then quite quickly comes up the suggestion to give it to a museum. And then I'm still discussing, is there not another solution maybe? And recently, normally we have one member in the family who is like the archivist of the family and who collects all the papers and the photos, and then normally he is chosen, or the others are happy if he does the work for the future, or the person who has more children, so there is a future assured in future generations. This plays a role. But it's a lot of negotiation, and of course not all family members like each other necessarily, so sometimes one really has to mediate, or we had cases where one family member pays out to the others I think it's a valuable solution. If there is a certain value to an object, why not pay the other, and then all feel good about it. For me, it's a good outcome as well. Yeah, but each case is different, really. And some families opted for rotating schemes that they do for each Pesach, one other part of the family has a Kiddush cup, for example. This is a nice solution as well. And in some families, we have more than one object, and then it's easier, then one can do a division. One family is part in the US and part in France, and there are 5 objects, so then you can make a division.
I had a question, but I just wondered if there was any other questions. Well, I don't want to, hog the mic. I just had a question about, as you mentioned, a lot of the silver objects have quite a small monetary value. So I just wanted to ask about the difference between restitution with, say, a painting that has quite a high value, so like a Picasso or Klimt, the very famous examples, and then the silver objects. And I just wanted to ask about if it was difficult to work out a new way of sort of doing restitution with these objects, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but it has its advantages. If you have a Klimt or Picasso for 10 million, you cannot give it back to the family because all families members would have to agree, and then normally it has to be sold and the sum has to be divided among the family members. And this is the difference. Here, normally there is an agreement, you can keep the cup, and this is much easier. And also the work is very different, also for us. And I didn't underline today, but these objects are also, in many cases, the only surviving material reminder of an existence wiped out by the Holocaust, because all the German Jews had to bring over many things. Later on, they had to hand in their cameras and their radios. But these are not recorded. I do not know a case where there is a restitution really possible. But the silver, thanks to the German bureaucracy, as you see here on this, even on this image, there it is possible in some cases to link it to the families really, and then to do this work. When the families were evicted from their homes, their property was sold to neighbors, and so it's impossible to trace anymore. The last case to Auschwitz is also not there anymore. So these objects are really what remains, and this makes also this work very, very special. But of course, the owners of the Klimts complain that I do this work and not work on the other. We do not have Klimts, but you know what I mean. And Yeah, the value is very, I think our silver expert made an estimate also for the assurance. If I are traveling, I need an assurance for the object. I think it's between 50 euros, which is almost the same like British pound, and 10,000. There are a few more valuable objects, but mostly it's a couple of hundreds of hundreds. And of course, what we did not mention, if a family chooses to sell an object, it's their property. They can do what, I do not know of cases up to now, but it's really up to them what they do with the objects.
Well, thank you so much, Matthias.
There's a couple of comments, stories online that you might be interested in. So Martin says, I have silver objects that I was told were given to non-Jewish friends who at great danger to themselves buried the items. And after the war, these objects were returned to my family in the US. And today I am still in possession of these items. And then David says, like Martin, our family silver was given to Christian family friends. They buried it in their garden and returned it to our family in 1947. And the same family saved my father's life by hiding him in their attic on Kristallnacht. So he says
Gina, there are these positive cases as well.
Yes. And then Dina's just linked to an article which is about how there is, so she says there is stolen Jewish property all over Germany, and it's an article in the Times of Israel, and she says in German households, and the title of the article is Jewish Ghosts Linger as German Households Still Make Use of Stolen Heirlooms. And actually we might, we're hoping not next year, but the year after, to have a short exhibition which is to do with a family in Austria, in Braunau, who had received looted items, and finally I think the granddaughter or the great-granddaughter of the person who received the looted items has restituted them in a personal thing. She chose to try and research who they really belonged to, and she's restituted them to the Jewish family who are in Britain. And they've done this whole, the two kind of great-granddaughters have done this whole project around it, and it's all quite interesting. But yes, that's an example there. Okay, so I think we're nearly out of time. I don't know if there's any final comments from the audience here.
Isolated cases, this is also reactions that pops up to our project. A lady came forward and says she has a piece of jewelry that comes from a Jewish lady, and she never wear it because she knew about that and never felt good about it. It was given to her. And so she gave the object to us in the hope, since we have the reputation to find the families, but in this case, the information is so scarce. So these cases are also there. And we have to find now a good place for this object as well. Some people are conscious that they have objects that do not really belong, but it's difficult really to trace the owners in many cases.
Right, I think you will all join me in thanking Matthias again for his wonderful talk. And I'd like to thank the library. Thank you very much. Yeah, and I don't think there's anything else to say really, is there, Gina?
I'd like to thank Matthias for doing his work. I mean, it's obvious you go well beyond your job description. You must put in hours and hours and months of extra work, and I'm sure it's very, very meaningful for all the people that you managed to connect and then reunite with family heirlooms that they never thought they would ever, probably had no knowledge of. So, as a member of the second generation, I'm very grateful to you on behalf of all the second and third generation that you help so selflessly and tirelessly. It's wonderful work.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you very much.